Hello, my name's Debra Dougal and I'm VAT partner at Haslers Chartered Accountants and Business Advisors. Like many of my VAT colleagues, I've taken the view that there really is so much uncertainty about Brexit since the referendum that there was no value in adding to the speculation and uncertainty by talking about what the VAT implications for UK business might be. I didn't want to be part of the white noise. However, last week the government published a series of papers looking at the arrangements they have in place in the event of a no-deal Brexit at March 2019. And actually in those papers there's some useful information about the VAT arrangements, which I felt are worth talking about, not only in a no-deal scenario, because after all the government are at pains to assure us that that's unlikely to be the outcome and that they expect to reach a deal with the EU, but also I think there's some value in looking at those because they may be relevant in some of the deal scenarios that the government's looking at. Gives us an idea of how they might be thinking. So I've looked at the white paper and summarised the areas covered into 10 categories that I just want to go through in a little bit of detail today. So as you'll see, I've summarised 10 bullet points that come out of the document titled VAT for Businesses if there's no Brexit deal, which is available on the gov.uk website, and I will be looking at sections from that document shortly. You'll see that I've greyed out 4 areas there. The importing vehicles from the EU and EU VAT Refund System areas don't really have anything I feel I can add, but you could have a look at the paper yourself if those are areas that you're interested in. And then the insurance and financial services and tour operators margin scheme areas, well, the reason I'm not going to talk about those is there actually isn't any detail in the paper at all. The government hasn't decided how it will progress those areas, and they are particularly complex areas which will be of concern to businesses in those sectors. In particular, the insurance and financial services concession that's currently available is a real concern. Turning then to the first of the bullet points that I wanted to talk about, headed Accounting for Import VAT on Goods Imported into the UK. Now the government has said in this section that their intention in the event of a no-deal Brexit is to introduce a postponed accounting system for import VAT, which would mean that rather than having to pay VAT to clear goods into the UK, the goods will enter the UK VAT free and the VAT will be paid on the VAT registered business's VAT return following the date of importation. Now that's a significant benefit for businesses that were concerned about having to start to pay VAT at the border where they don't currently have to do that when bringing goods from the EU. The cash flow disadvantage would have been significant. But what I think is more pertinent here is in fact the government intends to extend that postponed accounting arrangement also to goods coming in from outside of the EU, which currently do have to have import VAT paid in order to clear them. Now it actually makes perfect sense that this arrangement would apply to all goods entering the UK from the EU, because after all the whole point of Brexit is not to have two different arrangements and for the UK to be able to set its own arrangements and not be limited by those in place in the EU. But certainly for businesses that import from outside of the EU, who perhaps thought there wasn't going to be that significant a change for them in VAT terms post-Brexit, this will be good news. Moving then to the next points I wanted to talk about briefly was about goods entering the UK as parcels. Now currently we have a low value consignment relief in place for goods under £15 in value, which relieves them from VAT being payable for them to enter the UK. Now the government's intention is that that LVCR will be abolished in a no-deal Brexit scenario, and all goods entering the UK from outside will be subject to VAT in one form or another. Now, as you'll see in this next section, the government's intention is to introduce a digital arrangement for goods valued up to £135, where the overseas seller will be able to account for the VAT using a technology-based solution, So they will charge it to the purchaser and they will account for it, and the goods will then enter the UK without any import restrictions. Now what's interesting about that is we are only talking about 7 months' time, and to my knowledge that technology-based solution does not yet exist, and so it will be interesting to see just how ready that will be come the time. And then for goods that are entering the country which have a value of more than £135, VAT will be required to be paid by the UK recipient in the same way that it is now, and so an import VAT declaration will be required and the goods will be held up until the VAT has been declared. The next area I wanted to talk about was UK businesses exporting goods to EU consumers. Now currently we have a distance selling arrangement, which effectively means that up to the distance sales threshold in the country where the goods are being moved to within the EU, UK businesses can account for UK VAT on goods that they sell to private consumers elsewhere in the EU. Now what that means is that up to that level, UK VAT registered businesses don't need to be registered in those other member states, and this is a very valuable concession to businesses selling relatively low values to consumers elsewhere in the EU. Now in a no-deal Brexit scenario, the government's arrangements will be that the distance selling thresholds will disappear, and that's obviously going to be the case across the EU, which means that goods leaving the UK going to private consumers elsewhere in the EU will have to have import VAT paid in those countries in order to clear them. And what that means in practice is that UK businesses will need to be VAT registered in those other member states in order to be able to recover that import VAT and then sell the goods within the individual member state. A relatively minor point, this next one, but just to say that the current requirement for UK businesses to complete EC sales lists, which detail the VAT registered customers elsewhere in the EU to whom they're selling, will be withdrawn, and so instead of an EC sales list, sales to businesses within the EU will be treated in the same way as any other export. The goods will leave the country zero rated, and the UK business will need to retain the proper evidence to prove that they have been removed within the specified time limits. So the removal of the requirement to complete EC sales lists will be seen by some as a benefit. And the final area I wanted to talk about was the UK VAT Mini One-Stop Shop, or commonly known as the MOS. Now at the moment we have two versions of the Mini One-Stop Shop. We have the MOS and we have the non-union MOS. Now in a post-Brexit world, the UK would be outside of the EU, and so any UK business would need to register for the non-union MOS to account for VAT on digital services supplied to customers within the EU. Now that non-union MOS will require them to register in another country outside of the UK, and they'll have to do that under the requirements of the non-union MOS as it currently stands. So that means that any business that's currently registered for the MOS and using it to account for VAT in other member states will need to register instead for the non-union MOS, which has a fairly short time limit actually for registration of just 10 days following the month of a sale, which means that there will be a deadline date of the 10th of April 2019 in the event of a non-deal Brexit, or indeed potentially in the event of a deal Brexit. And just to say finally, of course, there is the alternative to the MOS, which is that a supplier of digital services to consumers within the EU can choose to register in each member state where those services are supplied, but bearing in mind that there is a nil registration threshold, and so you could be registered throughout the European Union for relatively small value supplies if you opt not to use the non-union MOS. Now, as I said, this document is part of a suite of papers that the government has published under the heading How to Prepare if the UK Leaves the EU with No Deal, which is available on the www.gov.uk website. It's definitely worth a read, along with the other documents on there that cover other areas of the implications in a no deal scenario. And I would urge anybody that's interested or involved to have a look through those papers, which are well written and which do give of information. So I hope that's been of some use. Nothing really added particularly to what's in the paper, but sometimes I think it's worth just hearing somebody talk it through who's got a little bit of knowledge in the area. And thank you for listening. Bye.